Okay, so welcome everyone to this last panel, and this will be on policy and regulation, and specifically on how do we craft the conditions for robotics innovation. So to start off, I'd like to read a small excerpt from the report, and this goes as such. So for many years, robotics was not a subject of concern in the policy and regulation frameworks of many African nations. Today, that is changing. Governments are beginning to weave robotics into national digital strategies, catalyzed by the growing enthusiasm for artificial intelligence. This increased visibility marks an important turning point, but it also exposes a fundamental questions about Africa's preparedness to govern technologies that will reshape our industry, labor, and public services. And then I'd like to introduce our panelists, starting with Dr. Barbara Glover. Currently a member of the African Union High-Level Panel on Emerging Technologies and Secretariat at the African Union Development Agency, New Partnerships for Africa's Development, so that's AUDA NEPAD. Dr. Glover manages the Program for Inclusive and Productive Use of Internet in Africa. She's also at the forefront of creating the Continental White Paper and Roadmap on Artificial Intelligence, while developing pioneering AI policy frameworks for key areas including food security, climate change, education, and health. She has extensive experience conducting research, analyzing data, and strengthening capacity on frontier technologies for socio-economic development. And our next panelist is Dr. Annette Hübschle. So Dr. Hübschle is the Chief Research Officer in the Public Law Department and co-leads the Global Risk Governance Program affiliated with the Center of Criminology at UCT. She leads Environmental and Planetary Futures Research Group, which focuses on the governance of environmental, climate, and AI risks and harms, illegal markets, and transnational crimes. Her research looks at the risks, governance gaps, justice implications emerging from AI systems as they interact with unequal infrastructures, exclusion, and environmental and security futures. In this area, she leads the AI governance and community engagement streams of the IDRC-funded African Hub for AI Safety, Peace, and Security at UCT. And then a little bit about myself. So I am a PhD candidate in robotics and AI at University College London. Previously, I was a machine learning software engineer at Kinesi, where I worked on humanoid robotics. I am a founding member of the Akili African Robotics Community, and where we organize annual workshops on robotics and automation at the Deep Learning Indaba Conference, which you may have heard a little more about from earlier speakers in the panel. Okay. Now, to start our panel off and kick off, so I will start with the first question. Can you please walk us through what we mean by policy and regulation in the context of robotics? And if possible, maybe use an example to make it understandable for our audience. Anyone who feels ready may go for the question. Yeah. Maybe Dr. Barbara, yeah?
Sure, I can come in. I hope you can hear me clearly.
Yeah, I think this is perfect.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me to this session. It's been really productive, and I've got to learn a lot about what's going on. Policy and regulations. So we could say policy is, so you're looking at this set of rules and guidelines that you want to use to protect a product. So let's say that you have, a health product that you want to bring into the market. So maybe the policy is around how we can ensure that those health products support our health systems. What are the talent and capacity we need? What are the infrastructure? What are the issues that we should be looking at? And then regulation is looking at what we should be mindful of in adopting those technologies. What are the systems that should be put in place? Should there be harm? Should there be anything that goes wrong? Because we always release these technologies with very good intentions, but you also want to be mindful of any possibilities of harm or issues coming up. And so you want to look at regulations as enablers to protect the general populace from any challenges that may come with the use of technology. I hope that gives you a short, good overview.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I think a key word there for me is the word protect and protecting the populace. And then Dr. Hübschle, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly.
You did. Absolutely amazing. I don't really have much to add. I suppose for me, policy is about strategic direction. So, a policy strategy could be, for example, what do we want robotics to do for society? Which sectors should it serve? What are the values that we that sort of drive adaptation? One answer could also be what kind of future are we trying to build with robotics and for whom? And I think for me, regulation is also very similar. Like, it's enforceable rules. We're looking at safety standards, at liability frameworks, issues such as data protection, licensing requirements, and certification. So basically, policies about strategy, and then regulations, sort of some rules, enforceable rules.
Yeah. Okay. So policy being regulation. So sorry. Policy being the rules for these products that we want to introduce, but then the regulation being more about adoption. Right. Okay. And so thank you for that. And then now for the questions. Given the diversity of needs and contexts across Africa, how can policy be designed to not just govern robotics, but to enable innovation that is both responsible and inclusive? Right. Um, Annette, would you like to start us off?
Sure. So a lot of my work has focused on community inclusion. So prior to working on issues of technology and AI, been looking at different sort of governance settings, such as in conservation, ocean, and other governance systems. And I think the most important thing is always to center the people most impacted by regulation and innovation. So it's basically not just about the people that are deploying the technology, so the people that create robotics or AI systems, but actually to ask who bears the risks of adoption and deployment. And then if we talk about inclusive, that obviously means that we should be designing maybe from the margins inward instead of like starting top down or from the center. So for example, look at how will this technology assist rural workers, women, informal economy workers, ethnic minorities, and then also look at which groups are most likely to be displaced or harmed by these new technologies. All these people should be in the room when we discuss policy and regulation. And I suppose for me, quite important in this space is that, we need to start by looking at African realities. So something that works in the global north is not necessarily going to work in rural contexts in Africa. We've got completely different systems. And, just to keep in mind that we have large informal economies, we've got a very labor intensive industry, we have high youth unemployment across the continent. We also have community-based social structures. So the international frameworks that we're seeing in this space, they're simply not designed for our realities. So, for example, the EU AI Act and some of the robotics policy documents that I've perused, they're really written for a context of very strong institutions, often very state-centric. They have
Mhm.
mature labor markets, and there's already high robot and AI density and deployment. So it obviously makes sense to apply these northern regulations to their context, but we shouldn't just take them over and think that we can do a small touch up and then it will fit, with our specific context. And even in Africa, I mean, we've got 54 different countries, states, jurisdictions, and with very different sets of contexts. So what might work in Egypt is probably not going to work in Mauritius or in South Africa. I think for me, something that to keep in mind is also like we can have adaptive sort of governance approaches. So learning by doing. I've seen that there has been some very interesting work in the robotics sphere in on the African continent. So you can work, for example, with regulatory sandboxes. You can have living labs. The drone corridor example that is also captured in the report I found particularly interesting, where basically regulators, communities, and technologists learn from each other in real conditions. And, rather than drafting rules in isolation away from what is happening on the ground, basically everybody's working together. So Malawi's drone corridors is probably the best proof of concept of adaptive governance systems. And I think we also need to be very careful about very narrow sort of framing around AI for good or robotics for development frameworks, because they often ignore sort of the bigger questions of resource extraction and community control. So the promise of technology for development can mask the reality of actually who bears the costs, right? Communities that provide the data, the land, the minerals, and the energy for these systems often are the least likely to benefit from these systems. So we really have to look at the regulation and innovation doesn't have to be in a state of tension. I think the tension only emerges when regulation is written without the people who understand the technology and also without the communities who will have to live with these technologies.
Okay. Wow. Thank you for that comprehensive answer. Yeah, so I suppose the part that stands out for me again here is just making sure that the groups that we mean, the technologies, the groups that we mean, the groups that we want to use these technologies need to be involved in the discussion, and we need to make sure that they're not impacted negatively when we adopt these technologies, meaning in this case, robotics. And then Dr. Glover, do you have any thoughts on this question? And just to recap the question, given the diversity of needs and contexts across Africa, how can policy be designed not just to govern robotics, but to enable innovation that is both responsible and inclusive? I think you're muted. Sorry.
Sorry about that. Yeah, thanks. I think this is helpful. What I could add is the fact that, you see, for the African continent, the first time I think most of us were introduced to robotics was through Hollywood, through RoboCop and Arnold Schwarzenegger and all those action movies where robots were seen as very scary things that were coming to destroy the world. And the generation that experience that kind of idea of robots are those that are our current policymakers. And so usually policy around robotics is to a large extent done from a very fear-driven perspective. And I think it's important that this community right here on this platform gets to understand that the understanding of robotics and AI is not uniform across the continent, and that there are so many sectors where it is seen from a very fear-driven perspective. And it's important that we help our policymakers to really understand robotics from a more open perspective. I think I joined the earlier session where there were some speakers that were looking at robotics, for instance, in agriculture and climate adaptation. So get your policymakers to understand that robots are not just the walking, caricatures that are coming to destroy the world, but they're actually going to be used to address most of the conditions that we have. And that is one major thing that will transform the way that we design policies on robotics across the continent. I think your intro, you mentioned that we haven't received from the policy space the needed support for robotics as we should have. Maybe if you compare it to other economies, and I think it's just this fear factor that has to be addressed. Now, moving beyond that, looking at enablers, I think one important thing is our skills and talent pipelines for the robotics industry, and the fact that we need policies that support skill development to get people to understand how to create some of these systems, because once you do that, there is that opportunity for them to explore how it can be used to address the challenges that we have. So our educational sectors, our curriculum reform initiatives should be used to support some of these initiatives. You introduced me leading a program on the productive and inclusive use of the internet. So what we are trying to do with our educational ministries and sectors that are currently under curriculum reform is to get them to explore how they can include in their educational reforms, robotics studies and coding and all these innovative ideas to transform our educational sector. And we want to look at it not from just ticking the box perspective, right? Not to just say that, okay, now our kids are learning coding and it's just maybe a few students in a private school that have access to that kind of curriculum, but how we can adapt it to our local systems, how we can adapt it to our African systems, having an understanding of our realities, how we can, whether it will be centers of excellence that will locate in certain areas such that children from rural areas, children from disadvantaged communities can also have access to some of that training and build that skill and talent pipeline that we need to be able to support that. And I think the other thing in policymaking that we are exploring with our regulators is the sandboxes and test beds. I think that sometimes, as I earlier mentioned, robotics is viewed from a very fear-driven perspective on the continent. So we want to look at sandboxes that make our regulators comfortable to say that, okay, we test it within that, and if it meets the standards, if there is no fear, there are no risks that we should be mindful of, then we can deploy it on a larger scale. And so those are some of the innovative policymaking initiatives that we are also deploying as African Union to be able to support our policymakers to govern robotics more responsibly on the continent.
Wow, thank you for that. Thank you for that response. So, that's an interesting point on sandboxes that kind of can be used to trial certain policies and speed up development. And a kind of follow-up point on this discussion. So we've touched on why policy and regulation is important, but sometimes on the ground, from the perspective of entrepreneurs who are trying to build startups, from the perspective of academics trying to build research labs, regulation and innovation can be seen to be at odd ends sometimes, meaning that sometimes you add so much regulation that it can stifle the progress of kind of trying to actually do the work, and the person ends up in doing more admin than actually kind of implementing and actually ideating. So in your view, how do we balance these competing views? How do we regulate just enough to protect African values, but at the same time, how do we not stifle our own innovation capacity? How do we not inhibit our ability to almost catch up or even kind of advance beyond what other more developed places around the world have achieved?
Yeah, thank you for that. So I think that one of the challenges with regulations sometimes, you can't govern what you don't understand. And sometimes the reason why there's so many red flags and full stops and administrative procedures is because there isn't a full understanding of whatever technology is being deployed. And so the regulator will place it by just ultimately putting in so many stumbling blocks than actually creating that environment. And that goes to my earlier points on the need for us to work together to get our policymakers and regulators to fully understand some of these technologies better. Sometimes we just assume they do understand, but I mean, having worked in this field in the last 10 years, I've come to realize they don't exactly understand it the way you think they do. And that sort of informs the kind of regulations and policies that are being churned out. Either driven by maybe a particular funder or partner who has a limited overview and then imposes that on the regulations that are being churned out. So it's important that we have some of these facilitated discussions, bring in the people that are actually doing, putting in these regulations and get them to really understand. Let's say, for instance, in this conference, we had maybe a couple of ministers or regulatory authority heads in here, and they got to hear all these great ideas that were being shared and all these examples that people were, putting out. That alone opens up their minds to some of these possibilities and prevents them from putting in all these stumbling blocks. Mm-hmm. That being said, we also want to be mindful of the fact that the regulations, as I said earlier, is also to protect us as people, because sometimes if you had a product and it says this product is FDA approved, you have a bit of confidence in using the product, right? A medication or a health product, because you know that it has gone through the right regulations and it doesn't have any challenges to my health when I take in the medication. And in the same vein, you also want to ensure that we are not pushing for no regulations at all because you want the freedom to innovate, because then you have the danger of it being misused or abused. And that might also reduce user confidence in the technology or the product that is being utilized. So we need to also ensure that balance whilst we are getting our regulators to be more open to the possibilities, the enormous possibilities that robotics offers to us as a country.
Yeah, thank you. And Annette, do you have any thoughts on this?
You know what? I suppose from practice, we know that a lot of polycentric governance is happening on the African continent. And what I mean by that is it's not always the state that enforces regulation or works on governance structures. So you often have traditional authorities, you've got industry, you've got professional bodies, civil society that get involved with regulation. And I think that is a really important starting point. And when you have these polycentric kind of governance arrangements, the most important aspect is actually that you have accountability. So basically, whoever is involved in regulation and governance is actually answerable to the people and the technologies that they're regulating. And it's important in our case, you know, we might not have a specific government department that is equipped to deal with all what is happening. You know, there's a specific new technology that comes on board, and you might actually have somebody in civil society that has the know-how and would also be able to kind of provide interesting viewpoints and accountability structures. I also think, you know, I often get asked, you know, how do we actually deal with these fast-moving technologies? Usually the technologies are much faster than what we can regulate. And I think here again, it is sort of the question of adaptive governance. And Barbara just mentioned, you know, how important sandboxes are. I've seen a lot of really interesting case studies where just learning by doing and working together has come up with really interesting governance structures. There've also been examples of principle-based regulation, where you basically look at the values that you want to issue. So it's about safety, possibly, or dignity, equity, and accountability. And basically you can, you know, the technical specifications evolve from that. So you're not just regulating a machine, but you're regulating outcomes that you want to see for the common good, you know, for the largest of the population.
Yeah, no, that makes absolute sense. So so having spoken about, you know, having spoken in detail about these sort of values, you know, we spoke about accountability, and then I think Dr. Barbara Glover also mentioned having some kind of maybe FDA equivalent. I mean, she mentioned the FDA, but I'm just curious about what an FDA equivalent would look like, you know. So especially if we consider the fact that we want to we want sort of like to collaborate across multiple countries, African nations, when it comes to creating policy and regulation that empowers robotics activity. So can you both kind of share what this might look like? Like, how do we harmonize regulatory frameworks across countries, like, so not just one country, but maybe the entire continent, or even specific regions within the continent. So maybe we start with, okay, Dr. Glover, you
I could give an example of what we've done with health regulations. So I did go into health because that's where I have been most of my working career. But with health regulations, what we have done with the regulatory frameworks harmonization, we had what we call the African Medicines Regulatory Harmonization Program, where we brought together health regulators from across the continent. Now it has even developed into an agency. We have the African Medicines Agency. All the regulators sit on it. So if you have, let's say you have a drug, maybe Tylenol, and you want it to be adopted in Namibia, South Africa, Ethiopia, you don't have to now go to each and every regulator in every country and get the approval. When it's approved on the continental platform, there is less bureaucratic measures, and you can get it deployed in the countries in which they've agreed to the approval process. And that's something that we could also look at for some of these frontier technologies, so that you're bringing together all the regulators. They are learning from each other. When you do that, you are building capacity. And there is a harmonized approach, because you don't want, maybe certain countries, they would have certain forms of regulation, other countries will have nothing. And so the developer then has to go to the tedious task of getting approvals in different forms and different processes and different timelines. But now you have it more harmonized. Once it's approved, you have it, you can deploy your technology across. But that's something that we could look at. We already have a lot of frameworks and policies that can be used. We have the Digital Transformation Framework for Africa. We have the EU Continental AI Strategy. We have the Malabo Declaration on Data Harmonization. So the frameworks are there. It's just a matter of us putting it into practice and bringing together the various, the actors, whether they're the regulators on board. I liked her comment, the previous speaker's comment on bringing together civil society. So it's not just like you're bringing together only the regulators, but in the spirit of inclusivity, you're bringing together other voices that you may not factor in when it comes to policy development, bringing them all in to sort of form a body, and then we can regulate some of these technologies and innovations more effectively. I think it will be a good action point from this conference, and to look at how we can move that forward.
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah. And Dr. Hübschle, maybe we can get a 2-minute answer, just in the interest of time. Sorry.
Yeah. I think that was a brilliant response already. I mean, I when I looked at the report earlier, I thought, that we do have some African-led harmonization already when it comes to data protection. And I think, I think this will become more and more important, looking at how to protect our data, where our data goes. And if you look at what the report captured, it looks like 65% of our African continent has already some form of data protection in place. And a lot of them are actually mutually compatible. So it's often just looking at, what actually works for our specific context. Can we adapt and we not just have it, well, it's not a wholesale importation of values from abroad, but something that fits our regional and continental context. So I think there's a lot of space for that. And I mean, of course, the African Union has done a lot of work. I've done a lot of work on harmonization and organized crime and environmental sort of regional laws in the SADC region previously, and that has also had brilliant results for enforcement and collaboration. So definitely a lot of promise on that front.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, so I think next up we can maybe take a question from the audience, and I think we had one here which says, what policy and what policy and regulatory frameworks can African governments implement to de-risk robotics R&D and commercialization for local founders, while ensuring safety and ethics without replicating restrictive Western compliance models that stifle early-stage experimentation in hardware? Yeah. I'm happy to repeat if that's quite a mouthful. But Annette, do you have any thoughts on that?
I would think, we were talking about sandbox kind of models earlier. So it's sort of learning by doing, having developers and regulators and impacted communities work together. And again, you have some principles that you agree on, and it should really be premised on, the common goods, what do we want for our society, and we work towards that. And the sort of technical specifications we will follow. I think if we agree on the values that underpin our broader policy and governance structures, then we already quite a distance. I think I would guard against, though, focusing too much on what a small club of technological, well, basically the developers. We need to really look at what is in the interest of society. So it's not the interest of developers, but the broader interest of African communities and society at large. And these values they're not always the same. I mean, we can see it when we look at Silicon Valley and some of the projects that are being funded. So not all of it is for the greater good. And yes, I'm part of that generation.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Dr. Hübschle there. And Dr. Glover, do you have maybe any final thoughts, particularly maybe on the part on de-risking robotics R&D and commercialization for local founders? Right.
Thanks for that. I think in terms of de-risking, I think maybe just to set the stage that we don't lack frameworks on the continent, as Annette has mentioned. The idea is implementation of those frameworks. So there is quite a number of frameworks and policies. On the continent, we have over 50 continental frameworks and policies signed by your ministers and presidents. So it just do a scan and you'll find quite a number of them. And if we implement them, we already are solving a lot of these challenges and the risks that come with it. We want to look at I think we need a sectoral approach to this. So you look at, rather than broad-based approvals of some of these policies and regulations, approach it from a sectoral angle, have your sandboxes to foolproof some of these innovations and ideas. And once there is that confidence that it's useful, then it can be deployed within that sector. And once that is also useful, then learnings from there can be applied to other sectors that may not be as that may not need to have more risky interventions at this stage. And that's something that we are open to working together to explore as the African Union Development Agency and see how we can move forward with it.
Okay, amazing. Yeah. Okay, I think that is all the time we have, and I'd like to thank our panelists for their thoughts on our topic. And with that, I'd like to hand over back to Kenny. Thank you very much for your attention.